I think that's pretty cool to just hear that this
Yeah,
guy is like,
yeah,
oh, season is like basically, and if you don't play during the season, you don't expect to like come back to the finals and playoffs and just be great. And it's like, okay, next season then. So it was really good to hear that he could come back and be really strong and fit, and that flywheel training could help in that sense, and provide a really good stimulus during that
yeah.
time. If I can
I've
manage
heard.
to get more energy into the concentric phase that I could do with my primary muscles, let's say, let's do the squat again, right? This is a good example. But if I use my arms on the way up, I will add more energy into the flywheel. So, and this doesn't really work like with weights, because people are like, yeah, but if I get help, I mean, if a coach is helping me
Mhm.
pulling, or if you use your arms, you're actually doing less with your legs, like, right? Because if I have 100 kilos on my back, you help me, I'm not lifting 100 kilos. But if a flywheel, if I'm pushing max, I'm pushing max. And then if you help me, it's more than max. We together put more energy into the flywheel. So in the top position, I will now have much more energy in the flywheel than I would be able to just do myself with my squat. So maybe you're pulling me on the way up, or maybe I'm using my arms,
Mm.
but there's more energy there.
If you have been watching the podcast for a while now, you'll have seen me wear these primitive athletic tops. They are now available, and I'm really excited because I work out in them a lot. I tend to work out quite hard, but I also like to be comfortable. So that's why when I was picking out the materials for this top, I went with a pure cotton. If you would like to get yourself a top and support the channel, they are available on my website, primitiveathletics.com. Athletics with an X. Hello and welcome back to PA Chalk Up. My name is Amani, and today we have Fredrik. How are you doing, Fredrik?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. If you just give us a little introduction on who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm the CEO, one of the co-founders of Exxentric, that develops flywheel training equipment like K-Box, K-Pulley, and now we also have some single exercise devices. So, but flywheel training. So that is what I do today. So I oversee basically all parts of the company, but I'll probably focus. I'm probably a little bit more into maybe sales and R&D mainly, but across the business, So that's what I do today.
Yeah. So how did Exxentric come about?
Yeah, so it's a little bit intertwined with my own personal story. But back then, I played ice hockey as I was young, and I then later on became a coach when I grew up. Realized I wasn't really good, and I didn't really enjoy playing in my team, so to speak. So I tried coaching in the same club, and I actually realized that was really funny and really fulfilling. And but then academically after school, when I graduated, it was time to go to university. I had this like natural science interest, and I
Mm.
I went to engineering, and computers were pretty hot. This is late 90s. Computers were pretty like still very young, right? There weren't like tons of educations. You basically had to go to like engineering to study computer science. So I went there and dropped out pretty quickly after a year or so, and decided to like focus on ice hockey, and I worked a little bit. But then that passion grew, and I realized like this is what I want to do. So I ended up in University of Health and Sports Science here in Stockholm, GIH, and on the coaching program, which is quite tough to get into. You apply through your sport, etc., and you need to have a certain level as an athlete or as a coach to get in.
Right.
And yeah, so I did that, and that's 2 years. So not really an SNC education, but I think I would say a little bit wider. It's very wide when it comes to, in terms of sports, but also anatomy, biomechanics, whatnot, testing, scientific methods, whatever.
So like a
And
sports science type degree.
yeah, exactly. So not tons. I mean, we had practical stuff, but that was more us doing sports
Mm.
to sort of like. But also difficult to go, yeah, complicated to go into, but not really what I imagine a SNC, more SNC focused education would be. So but anyway, I got more interested because at that point when I was still coaching, I to me ice hockey had been the game. Ice hockey, I was technical coach, and I was teaching youth, so youth
Mm.
teams, so that was my focus. So there's a lot of development, and the focus is obviously like skate, pass the puck, learn the game, play the game, strategy, whatever, like tactics. So and you don't have a big S&C part in youth sports in that sense. So it's sort of very general skills that we did. And at that time, I was also sort of level up to coach elite juniors at basically at the same time as I went to the school, and I learned more about physiology and biomechanics. I got really interested in physiology. So after that education, I went
Nice.
to go deeper into physiology. I went to Karolinska Institute and studied physiology for a year with the goal to go into research. And I was pitched to join this, like, you should talk to this group that they focus on hypertrophy and strength, and those are the kind of guys you would probably like them. Because being in ice hockey, momentum-based sports, fairly, physical, like, yeah, it's a lot about, mass and strength,
Fast,
whatever.
yeah.
So they're like, yeah, you're probably going to like these guys and the research. And they were focusing on training in space, so basically keeping muscle mass. But it's the same thing, right? You want to optimize for building muscle mass and find effective methods. The only difference was like they applied it in like microgravity, like space. So but
Right.
they worked with flywheel, so they used flywheel for that, which was kind of interesting to me because of these other like features that I realized, like, yeah, this is have a tons of other positive features that we can use on earth. So uh, then was a long like sort of detour where I actually realized I need to go deeper into academy before I go
Mm.
into research. I started with medical school, ended up doing a degree there, and then I actually found working with patients kind of fun. So I like did all of that, my all the internships, whatever, and I actually became a specialist MD. So it's a pretty long 12-year detour, but during that time. Uh, Long story short, we worked a little bit with these researchers, but they were really focused on their single exercise devices and space research, and we wanted more go into product development because we
Mm-hmm.
felt like, yeah, the concept is cool, but it doesn't really. This is not really what our athletes are doing. They're not doing pulls, rows, squats, whatever. They're not doing like these fixed machines things that they were doing in their lab, and you couldn't really buy a flywheel device at that time. They were handmade by a mechanic that the researchers basically knew. So a couple of years later, me and a hockey colleague of mine, Morten, we sort of founded Exxentric and said like, okay, let's see if we can do this on a more industrial, and then it was more focused as a sort of product development focus,
Mm-hmm.
with our sort of the starting interest was like the science and the performance and the coaching, but then we sort of went into the like product development because we need to create this tool because it doesn't exist, right? Or at least not with the properties that we wanted. So that's how Exxentric was started. Then we are at 2011. I'm still working as a doctor. Morten is working as Swedish Olympic Committee, training, testing, and education of coaches. So this is something we do on the side, and we're five co-founders,
Wow.
and yeah, three of them actually dropped out pretty quickly. So, but me and Morten are still in it, and I work full time, and Morten is focusing on his day job, so he's just on the board.
Mm.
But So that's how it started. And a couple of years in, we started like realizing the hobby grew, and spent my free time, weekends, whatever, like travel, doing lectures, maybe stuff like this. And it was pretty tough to manage with also a
Yeah.
pretty demanding full-time job, family, etc. So basically juggling like two full-time jobs. And so I had the opportunity to switch over and lead the medical business and focus on Exxentric. So
It's
which
paid
made
off.
sense. We started,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
paid off.
and yeah, and then it like it kept on going well from there, and we employed people, and so now we're around like 30 people in Stockholm at our
Nice.
HQ. So we have all departments at HQ: R&D, marketing, sales, finance, production, and then we have an office in the US as well,
Nice.
with sales staff. Yeah,
So, can
so
you explain how the flywheel actually works and what are the benefits of it?
yeah, so uh, it can be slightly different variations, but I'll talk about how our devices are because they're fairly similar.
Mm-hmm.
Within between the products, you can do it a little bit differently. But in general, like you need a flywheel that you need to accelerate. So usually that is on some type of shaft, and then you can have a cord or a belt or something that you sort of wind up around the shaft. So basically, like you would be, you know, turning on your like your lawn starting your
Lawnmower.
lawn mower
Yeah.
or something, like pulling and you something is spinning, right? So in the same sense, so it's basically like a yo-yo, right? Because when you're applying force to that belt, we use belts, so you're gonna, and it's wound around the shaft, it starts rotating, so you want to, it starts rotating the flywheel, so you basically put your force becomes like rotational energy. And exactly, see if we can get a video. Yeah, exactly. So you're not lifting against the weight. I mean, with the weights, that, yeah, I mean, we have other properties as well. We have rubber bands, we have hydraulics. But I mean, when I compare now and say traditional means, I mean like traditional weights.
Mm-hmm.
So most stuff we do is gravity dependent, and the load is fixed, and then we apply force to it. In this case, so flywheels are different because they basically want to resist more if you try to accelerate them more, and this is like Newton's second law. So to change like the speed, or I think it's the second law,
Yeah.
but
For every action, there's an opposite and equal
yeah, exactly. But
reaction.
you need to apply a force if you want to change direction or brake or accelerate. And with flywheels, is kind of special because it actually, if you pull, if you go gently, it's not resisting that much. So
Mm-hmm.
I usually compare it to people that haven't tried it, like a little bit like walking in water, because the water doesn't do anything if you stand still, and then you fast you try to move. And at some point, it's almost like you're running in like almost like a, it's almost not almost like a solid object. If you
Mm-hmm.
go out to fairly deep water and try to run, it's almost like you're hitting a wall. um, and yeah, and flywheel is sort of working the same way. um, and that have a lot of benefits. We're working with energy, so we're, this rotational energy, and makes so the flywheel also, you can have a sort of a memory, right? Because the K box that we saw, when you pull it up, if you do a high pull, if you go max, the flywheel will remember that, right? Because you put more rotational energy into the flywheel than you would if you had gone gentle. And flywheel never forgets, so it's going to pull you down, and you will have to absorb that same amount of energy, and that's very different from a weight. If you rip a deadlift off the floor, the bar and the weights wouldn't know, right? It will still be the same load
Mm-hmm.
on the way down. You don't get a heavier eccentric from ripping it off the floor. And flywheel is different in that sense. And so the benefits are quite many. And so with this like energy, and also like this variable resistance, like if you go harder, it
Mm-hmm.
sort of works more against you.
Yeah.
uh, the benefits is that we're getting closer to like a max tension all across the range of motion. And a lot of people, usually you can feel that it's super clear if you do, for example, a leg extension, where you feel that you have the load all the way through. It's like a long acceleration phase basically, versus with weights you have that initial sort of
Ripping.
acceleration phase, and then you're basically just pushing through, which is quite common with a lot of gravity loaded exercises, if you don't load it up really close to max, of course.
I think the flywheel is really good to get a sense of the eccentric part of. I know it's in the name, but the eccentric part of the lift, because you're not only fighting the gravity, but the gravity is kind of pulling you down at the same time. So it's like kind of having to catch it at the right moment, or lower yourself in the right amount of speed to sort of catch and then keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't really skip out on the eccentrics, because then you would basically end up in that hole
Mm.
where the dry belt goes down, right? So you need to absorb it, so you can't really skip out. So in that sense, it makes you do the eccentric part that we also know is really important for building strength and mass. If you take that away, you can compensate. I mean, you can double the amount of concentric work, but you will still basically not get any effect. So combined concentric and eccentric are really important to build strength and mass, which is, key thing that we're doing in SNC to, build up our athletes. So the variable resistance all through the range of motion, but also between reps, right? So I can go 100% from rep 1 to 10, and I would basically go max every rep. Obviously, I will fatigue, so I won't be able to sort of, push or, accelerate as hard, maybe in rep 9 and 10, because I'm starting to get really fatigued. But it will be max input from me, like the nervous system. I'll still try to go max. So I will, in that case, get sort of a drop set with the maximal repetitions, but in a very more like faster dynamic way that I would be able to do with weights, because I need to shift weights back and, or drop the load. So between the rep, but also in the rep. So I don't have any sticking points really, because, for example, in a squat with the sticking point, usually around right above like a parallel. You're able to push less, so the flywheel will resist a little bit less. So you don't really feel that sticking point. You just feel the load depending on how you accelerate. And if you try to go max all the way through, you will feel sort of max load all the way through.
Yeah.
So it's.
Sorry, no, continue.
Yeah, so I would say, so it's fairly like, for me, training, one person training myself, they have this no sticking points, and also like, do reps, but also like in a team setting, it's because you basically set an inertia to sort of like, today we're training fairly heavy and slow because we want to focus on max strength. And then it doesn't really matter if you just got 200, 250, right? We're both going at maybe 90%, trying to get out like 4 reps or 5 reps at this, load that we were prescribed. But we don't really need to change weights, between us, because we work sort of within flywheel, work more in zones. So team settings, group settings, and also, switching between exercises, you don't have to. So it's a little bit faster, and the transitions are faster. And then of course energy based. So, and that opens up, like I said, it has a memory, so you can use that energy. So a lot of people I see, please don't just do a regular squat on the K box and post it to say like, oh, eccentric overload, because I don't like that. Yeah. I see that tons. Like, so
really?
You don't get eccentric. Yeah. I see it once in a while, but it's a quite common misconception that people think like, oh, I'm on a flywheel, it gives me eccentric overload. Yeah, it's a great tool to get overload, but you don't get overload like out of nowhere. Because the energy you put in the concentric phase is the energy you absorb in the eccentric phase. So it's always 1-to-1. You can't really sort of change that. That's just a physical, like, because if you don't absorb it, you will end up being pulled down, until you stop. But you need to apply a few, if you want to call it tricks, or, we call it different like applications. But there's no magic overload coming in, so you need to apply. So there's quite a few methods that we use in our courses.
What methods is that?
Sorry?
What methods do you use?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, on general level, you can work with either time constraint, what we call it. So you have to excuse us, but we basically had to invent the naming of all these basically ourselves, because when we started in 2011, people were like, still, eccentric overload was something you could find a few studies on, but they were weights and big machines or people spotters helping, but people weren't really doing eccentric overload because it was so complicated to do in the gym. But people could see like, oh, there's a paper, what happens, but nobody's doing it. So, but we actually started doing it, and now you could do it. So we had to like figure out names for all of this. So this is our own naming, and to some extent the research catched up, and they do more studies. So now we can see sometimes a little bit of a clash, with our naming. And so. For example, we talk about eccentric overload. That's what we've been talking, and now you can see like accentuated eccentrics. For example, in research, it's a so more common term that they use. That we don't use it. Usually, we talk about eccentric overload. Anyway, but that's the same thing. But you can use a time constraint and an energy constraint, we call it. So basically, time constraint would be like, if I push all the way through in the concentric phase, like 100%, or let's say 100% just to make it easy. And let's say that concentric phase is 1 second. And then if I just let it pull me down without not absorbing on the way down, and then like let's hit it just before my in the squat, like just before my sticking point, so the last third of the
Mm.
motion. So I'm basically absorbing everything in maybe zero point 0.5 of a second or zero point 0.4. I will have to apply zero point 0.5 seconds. I will have to, because I have half the time to generate as much energy. So I
Yeah.
need to double my power output. So I focus on that part of the range. So I work less in the upper part of the range. So basically it's zero eccentric overload, but I sort of focus it on the part where I want to sort of get my overload. So time constraint create usually like a focus, so part of the range of motion. So that's not usually where I think people should start. But all studies that you will see on eccentric overload, basically, I think maybe there's one that hasn't, but basically all, when you see flywheel overload, it's they only use one type of overload, and that is basically they drop down a little bit in the eccentric phase, so they just
Mm.
follow through with the first third, and then they absorb for two thirds to get about like 30% overload, but in a part of the range, and that's
Right.
usually that two, not the first third, which is kind of funny because a lot of these studies also look into like sprint and jump, performance improvements, and then they sort of taken away the eccentric load in that part where you really would like to be strong
Yeah.
if you want to do sprint and jumping. So it makes zero sense. But you would see that, like, if that, check the method section, if it says eccentric overload on a flywheel, I can bet you, 99 times of 100, they just skip the first third and then, sort of braked harder at the bottom. And
Yeah.
especially when they, do it with performance metrics, it very rarely makes sense. But then say like, oh, we don't see flywheel doesn't really improve sprint performance. No, because you trained like a, power lifter or a Olympic weightlifter for the catch phase down deep. So yeah, I would be surprised if you got a lot of results. But
Yeah.
anyway,
That
that's
makes
me
a lot of
ranting. But
sense. That does make a lot of sense. I previously told you about my experience with the flywheel, and when I was getting taught to catch at the bottom and just like literally just let it, just essentially
yeah,
just drop down and catch it, and then you
mm,
go again, as opposed
yeah,
to holding that load. And I think I started changing it up when I started following you on Instagram, and then I saw that you were actually controlling the weight down and then exploding back up, controlling the way down and exploding back up. That makes a
yeah,
lot of
exactly.
sense.
Or if I want to do for sprinting and jumping, I would say like, yeah, but stop as soon as you can after the turning point. Like go deep, accelerate, put a lot of energy into the flywheel, and then just hit the brakes as soon as you start bending your knees. Hit the brakes, like use your end range power. You're super strong up there. Absorb maybe in the first like 15, 20 degrees in a super shallow, like not even a quarter squat, right? And then you just push back with your quarter squat just to get a little bit of motion back into the flywheel because you stopped it, right, and then you sort of do your little quarter squat, get a little bit action, into the flywheel, let that energy pull you down to the starting position down deep, and then you go again. So it would be like one long concentric, short eccentric, bounce back, start deep, and then, a lot of energy in, and then you would train your like end range, or like if you want to focus on the end range power. But yeah, so that, and you would find zero studies on that type, and that's what a lot of our users are doing because they
Mm.
train a lot of, field-based sports, jumping, sprinting, and they're not working in that very deep like knee angles. So at least for their sport specific part of like the, maybe coming close to the competition phases, and they start working really on power, they're probably doing much more like that. But
Mm.
that's like sort of uncharted territory. But yeah, so that's something we discuss a lot in our courses. I mean, our master course is usually like 2 days, and yeah, so we dig into the research, and you really need to go into the method section. But
Mm.
that is as a rule of thumb, they basically, and I think it's actually historical reasons, because the first research, the space guys, they were just interested in see like, can we get an overload? So that this was like super early. So they started back in, let's say I hooked up with them in around year 2000 something, and
Right.
they maybe start publish their first paper in like 97, 98 or something. So they were still super early. Flywheel was like unknown, and they were basically looking at, is can we use this to, build strength at
Mm.
all, right? So they were still at these super basic things like EMG, checking like, do we get the same muscle
Muscle activation.
activity
Yeah.
if we do flywheel versus like, so very far from application. And they tracked like the forces. So it's like, oh, we see fairly good, we see really high muscle activation, we see, good force output. So this could probably be a good strength training tool. So that's where we're there at. And now today, 20 years later, we are much more into the application. So if you see studies now, it could be like, oh, handball players or soccer players in season protocols or
Mm.
PAP or whatever. It's much more like, yeah, because it develops. But the fun thing is when people still do overload, they so go back to like, and copy what people done before. And those guys started with that, don't decel for the first third and then you decel. So that is what everybody's
Mm.
doing now, even if it doesn't make sense. So that's kind of funny. But so I try to talk about it. So hopefully some researchers and younger guys like C or like SNCs and researchers maybe talk and do like develop projects together and see like, yeah, but this makes sense, or this is what we actually do in practice.
Mm.
So that's something you can put in your study, or so yeah, hopefully it's getting better.
Yeah. So this is something that I kind of wanted to get into was what applications have you seen being done on sort of the sport and on the eccentric that you've built?
Yeah, sure. I just realized I just answered half of your question because I talked about time constraints.
It's
So
all
maybe I just
good.
want to, yeah, I just want to, so we don't drop that. I mean, people might get annoyed. So the other way is that, like the energy sort of, we call it constraint, but it's not really constraint. But anyway, if I can manage to get more energy into the concentric phase that I could do with my primary muscles, let's say, let's do the squat again, right? This is a good example. But if I use my arms on the way up, I will add more energy into the flywheel. So, and this doesn't really work like with weights, because people are like, yeah, but if I get help, I mean, if a coach is helping me
Hmm.
pulling, or if you use your arms, you're actually doing less with your legs, like, right? Because if I have 100 kilos on my back and you help me, I'm not lifting 100 kilos. But if a flywheel, if I'm pushing max, I'm pushing max. And then if you help me, it's more than max. We together put more energy into the flywheel. So in the top position, I will now have much more energy in the flywheel than I would be able to just do myself with my squat. So maybe you're pulling me on the way up, or maybe I'm using my
Mm.
arms, but there's more energy there. And now on the way down, I can absorb that myself with my squat, or maybe even switch motion patterns. So quite popular one for the hamstrings are doing like a deadlift on the way up, and then they do an RDL on the way down, because
Mm.
usually the quads a little bit more on the way up, more go down deep, they pull, generate as much energy as possible, like sort of try to lock the knees as much as possible, or like just a little bit of flexion and then try to absorb with the posterior chain. That would overload them because you're using a stronger pattern, than the RDL on the way up, just to get that RDL
Mm.
overload, so to speak. So that is what you can play around with, and the energy overload generally gets it's probably best for because you can overload the whole phase with the time constraints we picked
Hmm.
apart. And this, so I would probably do like start with the 1-to-1. What we call is the sort of 1-to-1 is when we say that, we mean basically what you're doing with your weights. Like you have a load up, you have a load down, so fairly like even, you push all the way through, you absorb all the way through, so you work
Hmm.
through a whole through the range of motion. You could be 100%, 70%, that's 1-to-1, fairly close to weights. And then when you do overload, probably start with a general overload to start overloading the eccentric phase in general, maybe adding arms, adding a spotter, something, or different movement patterns to overload that eccentric movement pattern. And then like third step, but like a little bit more specific, I would probably go into the like, okay, let's now focus on the sticking point, or like
Mm.
focus on the upper range, or let's focus left to right. Like if we have a lot of shifts, cutting, whatever. So maybe we want to do squat up and then lateral, absorbing on, one leg more or whatever. So, or, alpine skiing, or, different, that
Yeah,
depends
yeah,
on your
yeah.
sport. So that's probably how I would build it up: 1-to-1 general overload, and then,
Like
uh,
asymmetric type
yeah,
sports. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, so that's just the general methods to, get overload. That doesn't come, just by itself.
yeah. How do you implement these into your own training? I know you're very big into powerlifting and you do quite a lot of competitions. How do you sort
Yeah,
of phase them out for yourself?
yeah. I mean, there are some really good things, and I'm actually having sort of logistical issues, which is kind of funny, because the whole idea for me to sort of, one of the things when one of the we had problems in sport when we, as young coaches, that when we found flywheel, we was like, oh, here's the solution,
Mm,
and one of these was the logisticals, because it's easier. It's like, since you don't have that weight, it's easy. You can basically have a gym wherever you want. And in the hockey teams that so the gym was basically across the city, right? So we couldn't, do gym when we wanted. If we had ice practice, maybe we couldn't do the gym. We have to do it on a separate day, or travel, or like so. And so today I have a little bit of logistical issues, because I love to train at my club with my friends in my team, and we don't have flywheel there, and I have flywheel in my gym at office. So then I have to train by myself, but I don't have any spotters or any friends around. So it's a little bit like logisticals. But there are some really good applications. I use it for peaking,
mm,
to hit that, so easy to hit, and get a good amount of volume on my sticking point without having to carry all that weight around on my back, because I can even go fairly sub max, and just hit that point where I know, if I just film my squat, my regular barbell squat, I see like, okay, I know where I'm struggling. I can try to hit that point. I film it and see like, okay, good.
mm,
I hit that spot with the flywheel, and I can feel it, like after 1-2 sessions. I can feel how that sticking point is moving a little bit. So I'm just hitting that spot. It's really good for back sets. Could save a ton of time. So my sessions usually take, basically half the time if I do it in our office. Uh,
wow.
probably because I have no one to talk to as well. But anyway, but also it saves a lot of time. I do a lot of warm up on the K box. I hit my working sets, and then I sometimes switch over to K box again to do my back off sets, which I can't do in my regular gym. Also saves tons of time. So, I mean, and saving time takes a lot of time.
Hmm.
Powerlifting is sort of, we don't train that much. There are other sports I think are, but the nature of the sports requires, significant focus, and you need to reset between the sets. So it takes, and it's a decent amount of sets and reps you're doing usually. So, and weights on and off, whatever. So it takes a lot of time. So saving time and peaking, it's been great around, like, you have always have like small, like, injuries,
Mm,
whatever, like your shoulders acting up. It ruins your squat, ruins your bench. You get a, gluteal problems. I had a little bit problems with my thighs. I had like acute back pain a couple of times, and then, like, you can't really get under a bar.
mm,
Can hardly get up from the chair, and I had these like acute back pains, issues where I can't even squat like 70 kilos under a bar, but I can still hit the K box like 90-95%, because I had the harness. So,
mm.
and it unloads the spine, and it's a much softer. I don't have these sticking points where I suddenly like tweak something or whatever. Like, I push this gentle through. It's like work. Like
Yeah,
working
yeah.
in water again, right? So I can push myself a little bit more if it feels good. I can push. So usually, when I have these periods of back pain, uh, and like I said, I can hardly walk. I go to the gym. I do a little bit of, slow reps, and I add inertia and, add intensity, and then I hammer out a really good session, and then afterwards I feel much better. And so it really helped me. So I don't have had any, despite having periods with back pain, like the last couple of years. I don't think I had to sort of skip squatting for more than a couple of days,
Wow.
basically. like over the years, and that time also adds up. So
Yeah, one of the biggest things that we've sort of spoke about on this podcast is making your athletes available, and that means like trying to keep them as healthy as possible and just keeping them at energy levels that they can continue to play the sport as much as they can. And just talking about sort of having your back pain and you're still able to go in, still be able to put in that effort. What kind of applications have you seen in that sort of sense in like the rehabilitation process or the prehab?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, just for example, like ice hockey, handball, I guess rugby the same. A lot of like fingers. I mean, if
Shoulders.
you just if you yeah shoulder, but if you land on your hand, if you get like a stick over your hand or whatever, maybe it's not even broken, like, but it's like you can't hold on to a bar for
Mhm.
maybe a week or two, like, and then putting something on your back that's heavy or benching, whatever, like, yeah, it's problematic. So even a fairly not super harmful injury to your hand or to your arm can be sort of really problematic when you're trying to work in the gym. So that's really nice. I mean, we seen a lot of athletes. I mean, training. They have cats. I mean, they're coming out of surgery. They just like load. They take on the harness and they take that one side out. It's
Mm.
like had shoulder surgery like a week ago and they're still squatting, or just using the hip belt or whatever, and can get some. And we had some really some good success stories there. I know handball, it's fairly big in Europe, so I guess maybe most of your listeners maybe are familiar with it. But there's a lot of injuries to hands, and we had this Icelandic player that played for a Swedish elite team, and he broke his scaphoid. I think he was like 16 weeks. It was like middle of the season,
Wow.
so there was just 16 weeks until the sort of what's called the championship rounds,
Right,
so
right,
to
yeah.
speak. So he was basically off for that like 16 weeks of the regular season. Couldn't play, obviously. 16 week of
Hmm.
cast, but he hit his leg. They had a K box. He trained a lot, and he could do a lot of things there and train his leg. And then he came back. They took him out of the cast, and obviously his arm was a little bit at trainers. But in terms of physical, his coach was like, "Yeah, he played great. I mean, he was the strongest guy in that. I mean, he's jumping, sprinting, whatever. He could train really well. So he came back really strong, and he was obviously he was one of their top players as well. So really good player. But I mean, I think that's pretty cool to just hear that
Yeah,
this
yeah,
guy's like, oh, season is like basically, and if you don't play during the season, you don't expect to like come back to the finals and playoffs and just be great. It's like, okay, next season then. So it was really good to hear that he could come back and be really strong and fit, and that the flywheel training could help in that sense, and provide a really good stimulus during
yeah.
that time.
I've heard some similar stories where sort of I've helped with athletes that combat athletes where they've got a long haul and then they fight and then they long haul again, but the power like output that they've been able to do on pads and on bags has dramatically increased by sort of just adding in this flywheel, and it doesn't have to be a massive session. You can do a couple exercises and still build up that base level of uh, power output. I'm going to put it because it is a
Yeah.
power output. The faster it was, like what you said, that it's got the memory. As fast as you
Mm.
go up, it's going
Mm.
to come down, and you're kind of having to hold and brace and then do it again.
Yeah.
Has there been any? Sorry.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of things to do, like with microdosing. And I know,
Mm,
I mean, I don't know if, I mean, I don't think, I'm not sure. I don't want to offend any other in football, but Leicester City, I think, made it a little bit, at least famous. Probably other teams maybe did it before as well. But I know what they did, and they used the K box for it, is that they sort of, when they had the games away, they brought the K box, and they also started with like training all the players after the game. And their successful season here a couple of years back, when they won with a little bit underdog, and they
mm,
they they, they, they won, and people obviously look into like, okay, what was their recipe, and then you could see like they used their starting players the most, they had the least injuries, and they performed really well in for terms of physical capacity, so they could pick their best players for every game. And one thing that they did, that I think basically all the teams do now at least, and probably maybe somebody did before as well, but that made it sort of well known, uh, was that they traveled with the K box and used it. So the players that's been on the bench maybe had a training session, they brought a bike, and they did some K box. So if you played 0 minutes, you had this
Mm.
protocol. If you played half, you had this protocol. And maybe if you played all 90 minutes, you did nothing, right? And then everybody could rest on the day after, and they could all come back to practice. And I think before it was quite common that people on the bench, they had an extra session the day after, the guys that played rested, and then they come back and they're like sort of out of focus. And I've seen, when I talk to like the NHL coaches and some of the others, like we did like a really busy schedule, NBA, etc., they have sort of a similar approach now when they use like training to sort of bring people up to the same level, even if they don't
Mm.
play the game. I think that, and in that case, I think the K box can be a really nice tool to have. It's fairly portable, you can bring it, it's easy, you can hit that fairly high quality reps pretty fast, you don't need like tons of warm up, uh, and yeah, so, and you can get reps that sort of count, and all the players can go
Mm.
through it. It's fairly quick to cycle through, so you can do it like post game, for example. So I think that's a really good application in terms of like load management and getting some quality stimulus in during a busy week, um, for sure.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask about the Cape Pulley as well, where it's sort of this very versatile type um, sort of mock of the K box, where you can sort of do different exercises with it. What applications have you seen it used for
Yeah,
for that?
yeah, absolutely. The funny story is like why we even started, why we did it, right? Because as a hockey guy, I was pretty happy with the K box. I can do my squats, deadlifts, pulls, rows, whatever, build muscle mass, and but then we saw guys buying our. We had a. I think it was a university. I have the picture somewhere, but it's kind of funny. But they were super happy. They bought like 3K box pros, our like
Wow.
biggest like premium model. And we got a picture, or I think maybe they posted it. But like, oh, super happy, we got our K boxes, and they put all of them on the wall. And we were like, what? Did they buy these? Like, I mean, uh, we're still, it's a fairly big investment, right? And then they screwed it to the wall. It's like, that's not really what you're supposed to do, right? It's supposed to be on the floor, but they wanted to do like the more horizontal movements, obviously, right? And so we saw that, and realized like, yeah, we need to make a pulley version. So but that's actually one of the things that triggered us, right? Now we really need to get going. We had talked about it, but then when we saw that, like, yeah, we can't have customers putting that on the wall. So it started with the K pulley, which is a beam, and I saw a device that is basically on the ground, and then there's a beam, and you attach that to a wall. There's also the K pulley Go version that is only the device that you can fit to a rack, or fits like the most common standards, like the European standard, like a Leico. Also fits. We have attachments for like Rogue's harness, 3x3 inch, etc. Some of these as well. But yeah, so that's a more, that you can move around. So obviously, it's same type of loading, belt, shaft, flywheel, and then but more for
Mm.
more horizontal actions, like rotations, maybe some, and actually, uh, for my own training, I actually use it quite a lot for my accessories. So whenever I'm in training in our office, I actually use the K pulleys quite a bit, like shoulders,
Mm.
arms, back. Yeah, really, versatile device for
What's your favorite exercise on it?
what type of exercise I
Yeah,
do.
what's your favorite exercise to do with a either a K box or a pulley?
Yeah, I mean, I really like overloaded rows.
Okay.
So on the K box, so yeah, we didn't see that in the mid, but we have a small tool that comes with it. It's called an angle adjuster, so you can lock down the dry belt to the side to offset the angle a little bit. That allows you to sit down a little bit more, so it's all become, even though you're standing on the K box, you're still leaning in.
Mm,
You can lean back a little bit more, and then you can push off with your legs to get some extra energy into, and then absorb with your back. And I think that's been a really good exercise for me, both for my, obviously a stronger back, good for my deadlifts, and also good for my bench and shoulder health. And sometimes I tweak this with I use ankle cuffs instead of having a grip to hold on to. I use an ankle cuff
mm-hmm.
that I just hold like a grab, and then for every time I do overload, it tries to pull it out of my hand. So I need to like close my
Grip as
grip, like
well.
isometric, really strong. So I really struggle with the grip. So it's like that's just a bonus. That's probably one of my favorites. It's really nice with eccentric overloaded, like triceps push downs as well.
Mm,
Leaning your whole body into the concentric phase and pushing down almost like a crunch, and then you absorb that. And so different versus like how we normally do like the tricep extension, like sets of 10, and you're like standing there in the cable cross and like, okay, one more
yeah,
set, one more set. You get tired and it's burning in the triceps. But versus getting these like maxable and overloaded, where you can just feel that it's just want to fly up, and you're trying to hold it down only with your triceps, and you have like your body weight and your tricep strength like coming back to hit you on the way up, and you're like trying to sort of lock it down. It's a really nice, yeah, I think it's really good for strength there.
mm-hmm.
So that's probably one of my favorite exercises for both, obviously the squat, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's uh, RDL is really nice too.
I previously showed you a video of mine. I quite like the split squat. It's quite
Mm.
hard to get used to that movement, but I really like single leg drives because if you can push off hard on one leg, you can sort of do a lot. So for me, the split squat stance is something that I like a lot. And there's different
Yeah,
ways you can do it as well. Like you can use the slant boards as well to sort of get more of that pushback on the posterior chain, and then you can just level out to get more of an activation on both ends. Is that something you sort of play around with as well?
I don't really do it myself, and in terms of like listen, powerlifting, when it comes to strength, powerlifting is really my sport. I'm a very bilateral athlete, so all these unilateral stuff, and I'm really bad at it. And But I mean, if for SNC or like team field-based sports or whatever, if you're training that type of environment, I think those are great applications, and those guys are probably way more athletic than I am, and with balance and everything, right? So yeah, I think it's a really good application. I don't do them myself, and if I do, I probably have a lot of support. We
Right.
touched upon it a little bit before the podcast, but I think that's probably a word of caution. Like if you're
Mm,
doing that with maybe even weights on the back or kettlebells or something they're holding on to, right? Loaded sort of, split squats, and you like those, and your athletes, know the exercise. If you just move over to K box, you also have that extra complexity of the flywheel that is sort of a lie, right? Depending on how much I decelerate, how much I push,
mm-hmm.
what it gets like. So not, every rep is a little bit like unique. You can't just feel a load in your hands and like, okay, this is how much I have to push, and then you do 10 reps, because it's a much more timing into it. So I think it could be, so usually if you do that transition from weights and it's a little bit more complex, I'll probably scale it down the complexity and just have them maybe having like two poles or a wall or something to hold on to,
Yeah.
or a rack in front of them, or a bar on a rack or something, just to get the balance right, to get the push right, and then sort of take it from there and build them up again so they can do it like you did
Yeah.
in your video. I think you had nothing to hold on to.
Yeah, that was my
Uh,
mistake the first time I ever did it. Is not have
yeah.
someone there to hold on to.
Yeah.
Um,
If yeah, and I mean, if it's too unbalanced, you're not really building strength anyway. So it also depends on, like, yeah, maybe you do it to just, do you want to challenge their balance, right? Or yeah, I could even see how you, for example, if you work as a personal trainer and training somebody for fitness, that you sometimes want to throw in like new things just to keep
Mm,
them motivated, or just give them a challenge to feel like, oh, this was really difficult, I almost fell, and then the challenge is like, oh, I want to get, be able to do this without falling, and then maybe they do and feel much more stable and balanced in a couple of weeks, and they feel better. But it's not really primarily for strength in that case, and that's fine if that's your purpose. But I'm just thinking, if you're building strength and you have that exercise, maybe scale down the complexity,
mm,
and then when they get kind of it, increase, because you have this additional sort of flywheel that's sort of alive, and it has its memory, whatever that we talked about, and the potential for overload as well, and the timing aspect of it. That a weight is so much easier in that sense, because it's just sort of dead. It's just 10 kilos is 10 kilos. It doesn't matter, right? And yeah, so
yeah. Can you explain so how these metrics work with the app? Now, when I was sort of using it and trying to get my way around it, I used the app quite rigorously to see if I was really hitting eccentrics or if I was just doing concentrics. Can you explain
mm.
how the app works in conjunction with training?
Yeah, so we have sensors built in basically most of our devices, have it built in, and it's an add-on for like the entry level K box, and for the K pulley go, the portable one. Those are add-ons, but for cables like them Pro and K pulley 2, that we saw here before, they are built in. So that's a rotational sensor that tracks the rotation of the flywheel or the shaft, really, and sends that to our app that's connected. So we get basically angular velocity, and your input, when you in the app, you input what inertia you have on, and basically with angular velocity and inertia, we know the energy. So we know the speed and we know the inertia, then we can calculate the energy. And we do that, like if we do that like hundreds of times per second, and we know the energy, we can also see like how the energy changes,
Mm,
from one time stamp to another. And the changes in energy over a certain period of time is the power in or out.
yeah.
So that's how we know the power. So we basically we track rotation. From there, it's a really sort of simple, I would say simple calculation to get, because we don't have any variables. We have the rotational speed and we have the inertia. Now we know the energy at any given time,
Yep.
and from there we can just, if we track the time, we also know like, energy increased, power was this, right? So power in and so power and energy is very exact. And from those metrics, we also calculate more. We can, calculate range of motion, velocity, etc. But there's a little bit more factors coming in, like thickness of dry belt, and some others. So it's not as exact as the power. But then we split up power. So in our app, you get average power over like rep one, average power rep two, rep three, and over the whole set. What was your average power? But also concentric and eccentric peak power. So that's what you can switch between in your graphs. You can see like, okay, this was my concentric. So let's say you go for a if you go for 100% on the way up, you sit down, like you said, you sat down, and the first time you did it, you sat down, and then you sort of absorbed really hard at the bottom. Then you would probably see the eccentric bar be much higher than the concentric bar,
Hmm.
right? Because you forced yourself to exert a higher power output in the eccentric phase through that time constraint.
Yeah.
So then you will see the bar. So really good for as a coach to actually, it's sometimes it's difficult to see, it's you can't really see, and especially for these type of delayed actions, it's you don't really see, did they, maybe they did start decelerating a little bit early because they didn't want to,
Mm,
struggle on there, right? So and a smart athlete would probably like, yeah, but if I start a little bit earlier than the coach wants, it's actually not that hard to decelerate because I start a little bit earlier. And you would see that on the bars, right?
yep.
Yeah, your eccentric bar is just as high as concentric bar. You're not doing, something is off here. Um,
No, I always say
uh,
that like anytime I introduce a sort of like new exercise or a new method of training, I always have to go through it first. So I know what to expect and what to look out for with my athletes.
Yeah.
So when it came to the K box, when I was at the bottom and I just absorbed it and then came back up, I was like, okay, that part was the hardest. So I know that I need to be a little bit more up tempo with the way I speak, the way I communicate during that time, because they're not
Mm.
going to want to do that. So I need to
Yeah.
make sure I get them used to doing that because that's how we want it.
Yeah. and and usually, I mean, you can also, that's kind of nice because you can do it a little bit gradual, right? You can start with the have them one to one, focus on the tempo, pushing a little bit harder, adding a little bit more inertia. They work through the range of motion, they understand how it works, like the sort of the practical stuff, like
Hmm.
how to connect, getting started, spin the flywheel a little bit, get a little bit momentum, stopping, changing, whatever. So they get that going, and the one to one, and then from there you can say like, yeah, now just try to sort of start accelerating, yeah, not on the top, but when you come down just a little bit, right? And then you can push that, and then within a few sessions you're basically doing quite heavy overload at the bottom. You don't have to go from here to here,
Hmm.
suddenly. Like I never liked the really things like, oh, today we're going to have an eccentric session, as an eccentric load, and then everything will be crazy eccentric. Like we do the normal stuff, but we just add tons of eccentric work. I can see how you can do it much more seamless and integrated, and maybe just do one set,
Hmm.
and then next week you can do two sets, whatever. So much more gradual, and the device really allows for that. A really fun thing we had they did at the University of Health and Sports Science, younger students following us like years later now, here a couple of years ago, they wanted to do a senior training, they
Mm.
did a senior training program, and they wanted to use the K-Box. We were there like in the first session just to help them get started, and the students, the in and out, how to sort of onboard the senior people and how to spot them, etc. And and before that, we always help them a little bit with exercise selection and stuff like that, and inertia, and give
Yeah.
them a few pointers. We were in the gym, and they were super healthy seniors, but they had no gym experience. So we put them towards, like, you have the, I don't know, when you have these wooden things on the wall, that you have in
The
the PE class.
bars. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So we put the K box in front of there. And it's like, here's something for them to hold on to, feel a little bit safe. And they started to do squats, and they did deadlifts or whatever. But we started with squats, and the students got it, and they trained them, and we left. And then it was pretty funny because we came back then, like maybe end of the study was maybe like 6 weeks later or something, and just checked up on them in the
Mm.
like last week. And then we could see all the seniors, because what the students have been focusing was like just basically pushing the seniors to push a little bit harder, right? So it's like, oh, looks good, go harder, come on, one more rep, and then you see they moving past, maybe they had a little bit of inertia, and they kept pushing them. And what the seniors were doing, and this was not like intentional by the students, but then you could see the seniors how they used the bars to really push off on the way up. So they used their arms on
Hmm.
the way up and got an overload on the way down. And it was pretty cool. Yes, like they built strength and they built confidence, and they started with balance, but after a while, like, yeah, they get used to it. So by themselves, over like 6 weeks of training, they were giving themselves overload,
Yeah.
you know uh, and
What were the
so
results
pretty funny.
of that research?
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't like peer reviewed,
Right.
so it's like student projects, but it's fairly. I mean, it was they had a good supervisor and everything, so it used really good methods. But I don't think it was published in a peer reviewed magazine. But it was. I mean, the what's really interesting to see. I mean, the power output, the increases in power output with these
Mm.
seniors. I mean, healthy seniors, they were super active. They were, walking and doing things. They weren't normally in the gym, but they were active and maybe doing some sports. And I mean, the power output was, I mean, just the first, like the newbie gains, like in the
Mm.
first couple of sessions, you could see they could exert so much power. I think they basically I think the power output was up like 50% just in a few, like the first 2 weeks, and then for the additional 4 weeks, I think it was up to like the double power output over the
Wow.
whole period of time. In, like, for example, the squats. from fairly low levels, of course, because they were like 70 plus, or 65 and up. Some were over 70. So, but still pretty cool to see. And I mean, other research has shown that as well,
Hmm.
that you can basically, in 16 weeks, if you take the average 60-year-old and look at their strength metrics, and then you take an average 80-year-old and then put them through a strength training protocol for 16 weeks, they get this sort of same power output as that average 60-year-old. So you can
Wow.
basically go back in time 20 years for 16 weeks of strength training. And that's been shown in other studies. So there's a lot of gains to get here for that type of population, like healthy seniors for sure. And another cool thing was also that the range of motion increased,
Mm.
probably a little bit thanks to them pushing off more and going and feeling more confident, but also building strength down deep and adding more overload, being pulled down and then like pushing hard at the bottom. So they build a lot of strength down deep. So they actually increased the range of motion. I think the average squat was like 10 centimeters deeper 6 week,
Wow.
and that wasn't something that they pushed in the study. Like they didn't really care about the range of motion. They just squat down and push up as hard as you can and absorb on the way down. And then by pushing harder and harder, building strength and confidence and being pulled down, yeah, they just went deeper and deeper and they felt fine. So that's also pretty cool, like a bonus, just getting that. And that strength that we know in, for example, seniors, where the problem is like getting out of
Hmm.
a bed or a sofa or a chair. That's really, I would say, like, if you want to say functional strength, I would
Yeah,
say that's really it, right? If you're 70 plus and suddenly can much easier get out of the chair, that's functional strength. So basically a deep
100%.
squat. So
Like the deterioration of elderly people as well come from their inability to sort of trip and fall and bounce back because they don't have that balance to sort of keep upright. So by increasing their strength and their mobility as well, I can
yeah.
imagine they were able to stay healthy for longer as well.
Yeah, and if we're looking at fall prevention, talking about elderly, I mean, I'm actually, maybe because I'm getting older myself, start to think about it. It's pretty cool to see, and it's actually about like the eccentric power, being able to like maybe slip, lose balance, and then sort of
Mm.
catch your balance again. That's not really, I mean, strength is the foundation, but it's really about eccentric power, and so dare to train like heavy and also to like move a little bit faster and actually train power. And so we actually had during started as a gym franchise here in Stockholm during COVID, with the lockdowns and everything. They had a senior group that were like healthy seniors came in for training, and they were devastated when they couldn't come in and train. So they did an exception for them. So they took these,
Oh.
I think there were like four couples or something. So they were like husband and wife, four couples that came in, and they moved and they got K boxes. They didn't have K boxes before, so they got K
Mhm.
boxes. And instead of being in the gym, they went to this big. They have this big hall where they have their group sessions, like with like a lot of people, but they had these like four couples, and they spread them out in that big hall, 1K box per couple, so they could work out together, but with like 10 meters
Yeah,
distance,
yeah, yeah.
whatever. And they came in like once or twice a week, and they had the really successful training period. And I think after that project, actually, one of the couples they bought their K box. I think they're probably
Oh.
one of our oldest users. They were like 75 or something, but they're like, yeah, we need to keep this. So they got one for their home. So that's pretty funny. But yeah, so I think there's ton. I mean, in general, strength training is for seniors. I think it's just
Yeah. In
it's
terms
such a
of
low hanging fruit.
load, how does that equate? Like what's the comparison between loads and how do you load the K box?
Yeah, so we load the flywheel. So we talk about flywheel workout zones, and so I would say, going back to the water. So imagine the depth, how deep you go in the water is basically the inertia you load up. So if you load up max, it's basically like up to your neck in water,
Mm.
right? It's still not doing any load on you until you start trying to move it. and I can still move it slowly if I don't. I mean, if you on a K-Box Pro, you can load up to 6 flywheels. That's a lot of inertia,
Wow.
and it's and so, but I can still go with like 20%, but it would move really slow, right? And pull me down really slow. So I'm not loading. So basically, it's like, I mean, on a bar, if I load up a 300 kilo deadlift, it's not like, yeah, I can lift it. I just have to do it really slowly, and it will come up eventually, right? It doesn't work like that. I need to make it break
Exact.
the floor. I need,
Yeah.
you know, inertia doesn't work that way. So the inertia is more to put you in the which zone do you want to work in. So if you load up max inertia, then it's like, oh, now you can probably go max, and you would still move really slow, because this is like trying to push a car that is stuck, right? Or like you're pushing a car, and then in the eccentrics, it's basically trying to stop it, like rolling downhill or something, right? It feels like it's just pulling you, and whatever you're doing, it just keeps on pulling like a moving train, right? And
Hmm.
you're trying to stop it. So 6 flywheels that are started spinning, right, and you absorb it on the way down. So that's more put you really close to that isometric max, or like really, on the force velocity curve, really close to like basically velocity zero max strength zone. And then by removing inertia, you will change zones, and that's we talked about. So it doesn't really, you know it doesn't really matter that much if it's like, super heavy or only, or super heavy. You would both be slow, right? And
Mm.
then it's your input into the device. So makes it both easier but also a little bit more complicated, because we also have these, it becomes a little bit more important also how much you push. uh, yeah, so the intensity combined with the inertia.
Yeah. What's the sort of easiest way to progress your load and certain movements with the flywheel?
Yeah, I would use the app, and I would start finding a comfortable zone, like what I feel. You can video yourself and see, like, is the movement speed, is it too fast? You can use the app to see, you get the average speed, so you can get some sort of velocity-based metrics. Are you moving like, oh, I'm doing max strength, and then you see like, oh, I'm moving 1 meter per second. Like, oh, you probably need to add more inertia because that's a little bit too fast.
Mm.
Um, and then you can also see that, like, okay, now I'm moving faster, I'm producing more power, so maybe add inertia, from there. If you see, when you during like a strength block, right, over 6 weeks, you might see, oh, I'm moving faster, add a little bit more inertia. And then after that, for example, coming into a power block, I probably like drop inertia and then go for maximal speed, and then try to push that and find where is my peak power max,
Mm.
and finding that and dropping down. And yeah, so that's like fairly, the pointers. So it's not like I can say like, oh, everybody needs this, or if you can squat this, you need this, because it's also, you can see people that are maybe equally strong under a bar, and one is sort of more faster explosive
Mm.
on the K box, but he's maybe probably also maybe a better jumper, or more elastic. So uh, like you can see also with weights, just because people squat the same weight in a back squat, they can still have different jump height, right? Because they have different, eccentric capabilities, whatever. So it's also, so in that sense, I think K-Box can also show you a little bit more about their performance, because when you say like, oh, I want you to go down here, hit the brakes, in the eccentric phase, and then just rebound up and use that. And if that athlete doesn't have that capabilities,
Mm.
he will just be pulled down and just be a little bit soft, and he's being sort of crushed under the K-Box a little bit, and then he will barely get up, and then maybe he will get a little bit speed when it's out of the hole and in the end range, maybe. While some other guys, you will see, by hit the brakes, and they explode up from the hole, and they probably like look different when they're moving and jumping and sprinting as
Mm.
well, right? But they could still maybe squat 200 kilos and look fairly similar.
Yeah, the
um,
interesting thing is no athlete is ever the same. They could put out the exact same metrics, but they'll be doing it differently as well, which is
yeah,
the hardest thing about coaching. But at the same time, it
yeah,
kind of makes it fun because
yeah.
you're sort of being challenged on your coaching ability to cater to these factors.
It's like if you take younger athletes, maybe like 13, 14, 15, and you test the jump height and you bring them up and do a drop jump, you don't usually don't have to bring them up that high to
Mm.
realize like they don't jump higher because you move them up higher because they can't use that eccentric force coming down. But if you take them back maybe 1 or 2 years later, they're still in their sport. You could probably, benefit from and increasing that drop height a little bit more because now they're more capable to actually use that drop to sort of jump higher. So it's about maturity and control and nervous system. This is
Mm.
more than like, yeah, how much can I squat? It's also like, yeah, but these other things and sort of transition of
Yeah.
power and the movement, right? So in that aspect, I think also flywheel can be really helpful because you have that dynamic in the machine. So you have that control aspect and timing, and that I think they can be really beneficial for them. Actually, learning how to absorb and brace, and and not only like just moving weight up and down and doing sets and reps.
I
Uh,
think it's the best like way I can think about it is it's controllable movement. It's like it's your way of applying these factors and these sort of inertias and different metrics and sort of just being able to control it in an efficient movement way as well, which I think is the hardest thing about the flywheel because it doesn't care if you're the best athlete out there. It's completely down regardless.
yeah.
When it comes to sort of the development of the K box, how was that process and how did you sort of apply these different methods?
You mean how we developed, from product development perspective?
Yeah,
I mean, um, you have to come and check our museum. It's pretty fun when you look back at the
I
first
would
K
love to.
boxes. It's like, I probably, I guess most of the coaches you've been coaching for like 10 years or 15 years, and go back and see yourself, or like find an old notebook what you did with your athletes. The first 1 or 2 years is like, oh shit, did I really do that to my poor athletes? Wasn't right.
Legit.
Yeah, we learn along their way, right? And looking back, we're like, oh, that wasn't too smart. Anyway, so the first K box is it's pretty cool. We see a lot of like these early generations still going strong. Actually, I have a few customers who you see posts here there, but yeah, it's only, we've always been very close. We started, coming from a little bit of like sports and performance mindset ourselves when we started, and now over the years we branched out more and we have more people employed. So we also like look more into the rehab side and even the fitness side and home user side. So, but I think the coaches in that aspect and the athletes has been very helpful to us, and
Mm,
having that relationship that we are sort of coaches to start developing our products and talk to coaches and get their feedback has been fairly easy for us to make that connection. And we understand what you're going through, like, yeah, we need to do this, we need to be able to do this, or have this many athletes or whatever. So like just improving. And I think applies sort of the, like, in any, not in any sport, it's not like any coach can go in and do and something magically take this
mm,
like losing team and make it a winning team overnight, right? It's a it's like you identify weaknesses and you see what the strengths are. You try to improve those weaknesses like day by day, week over week, and then gradually you become like a better team and or a better athlete. And that's, I think, what we apply to the K box as well, like seeing like, oh, small improvements
mm.
here and there. I know we counted, for example, we when we hired our first engineer, she had to do, we did a lot of changes to the K box after she started. So I remember talking to her about that maybe when she's been working for like 2.5, 3 years. I'm like, do you know how many changes you actually had done to the K box since you started? She's like, yes, I lost count at like 200, you know,
Whoa.
because that's within like the K box 4 generation. So still like, and it could be super small things like, let's move this whole, 1 millimeter here. So it's like actually easier to get the screw in for the
Mm,
guys in production. Or if you make this a little bit stronger here, so it doesn't, break as fast or whatever, that we see. And I think also that's a strange for, because we've been doing this since, we've been doing flywheels in year 2000. We know how it, works and how it feels. So I think I think it's appreciated by coaches talking to us because we've been, dealing with this sort of feeling or tool ourselves for 23
Mm,
years or pushing for 24 years. And so they're able to communicate with us, but also in terms of having product out on the market for so many years, we capture a lot of sort of data over time to see what actually wears down faster, what needs to be improved, and to improve that
right.
product. But I would say that's when you talk to the marketing department, they always want these big things like, oh, for this next generation, we bought these like new big splashes. What's new? And like it's fun to put in like a new feature or like a really big improvement that people notice. But I would say that most of it is like the daily grind, just improving small things here and there, like over time, every day, week by week, and yeah, and
I
then
think
it's
that
like,
talks about the durability of it as well, though. It's like because you aren't just wanting to push for the biggest, flashiest thing. You're actually working on these, which was actually very nice to hear. Is like you're pushing things by millimeters just to stop the wear and tear, or just extending the longevity of it. What's been one of the smallest changes that you have made that's made the biggest difference?
oh, uh, I don't know really. Yeah, I know one super small, yeah. Uh, they're stackable.
Are they?
Yeah, the devices are stackable, so you can stack them on top of each other, right?
Yeah.
So they don't take up space. And we also stack them in our factory, and then we stack them upside down because, yeah, for practical reasons. So they're stacked upside down when we have them in our factory before we ship them. And then we were like a little bit frustrated because they actually, the dry belt goes over when it's assembled and the dry belt is going around, and it actually it adds a couple of millimeters on one side because the dry belt goes out
Mm-hmm.
on that one side. So, and then you stack like 10 or 15 on these on top of each other, and then they actually, the whole pile
Yes.
starts tilting a little bit. And that was we so that's sort of set the limit how high we could stack them. And it was super funny because we had a guy coming in. He came in to do he was maybe coming in to do a little bit extra work. So we was just having a tour to see like, oh, this is where you will work, and and he was still back in school, so he was like 17 or 18, so looking for him extra work. And he saw one of these piles and like, yeah, where's his leaning? I'm like, yeah, I actually don't know. And he's like, oh, it's because of the dry belt goes on this side, whatever. It's like, but if you just made a little bit of a hole here in that part where it's where it passes, they would be straight. It's like, yeah. So talked to the engineer. They added
Wow.
that hole. Week after we had that hole, and since then the pies have been super straight. So that's not the cost something the customers will notice, but we've been seeing those pies, leaning, for months. And then this kid comes in and like, yeah, you should just make a little bit of a dent here for the belt to pass through. We're like, oh, good. We didn't think of that. So yeah, I can't really come up with anything like the small, but that's a super
Yeah.
small change that at least had a big, made a big difference for us at least.
I
Um,
think it's quite nice that you're sort of listening to your employees as well and sort of like making these little tweaks to make their lives better as well.
yeah, I think. I mean, I think I see the whole company as basically one of my hockey teams or like any teams. I'm a team sport guy. That's how I sort of was raised, playing team sports. I've done a lot of team sports and being coached. So for me, it's like, yeah, we win together, we lose together, and I mean, we need to find. And sometimes we're struggling against an opponent, and somebody is like, yeah, but you need to. The goalie sucks. He needs to do this, or the defenders need to do this, or the forwards. But we need to agree, and we need to find. Or sometimes you find a key, like, oh, actually, the goalie sucks on shots, low shots. You should do low shots on this guy because I saw that, blah blah blah. And then sort of spreads in the
Mm,
team, and we find his weakness. Like somebody finds his weakness and spreads. That's how you interact in a team. You find his weak spots, or on one side, or we realize something they can't handle, or what works. So And I think in a company it wouldn't make sense to do it any other way. I mean, we have, sometimes we have these big staff meetings, and suddenly like an intern could be like, yeah, but shouldn't we do it like this instead? I'm like, yeah, good idea. Whatever. I mean, if that's the best idea, then it's the best idea. We don't really care. And if it's, so I think that's at least how we run our
Hmm.
business, like a big like team sport, like a team, and we're winning together or we're like losing together.
Yeah, no, I really like that
Uh,
because it builds that community as well within the workplace. Everyone's sort of out there helping each other as opposed to like fighting each other as well.
yeah,
What's one
and
sorry?
no, I was saying, and it's also like, yeah, I see how people grow. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, you have athletes on your team, and they will have individual weaknesses, right? And they need to have accountability for, like, oh, maybe one is not as strong. They need to identify that and work with that, And somebody else has maybe super nervous, and they have maybe a more of a psychological challenge that is their main thing holding them back for performance, etc. They need to be able to see that and work with that instead of shy away from
Mm,
that or just showing their strength, right? So that's how they grow. And so I think in terms of that relationship towards individuals as well, I think it's like it's more of a coaching aspect for me than really being like the boss or something. And I think that I see also now we're quite many. Not everybody obviously reports directly to me, so I have people reporting to me that have people reporting to them, and I encourage them to do the same way, to sort of having a little bit of mix, being close sometimes
mm,
when something is new and they onboard somebody, be really close so they feel safe, and then let them go, give them a little bit more leeway, check in, and then after a while maybe give them bigger tasks, more open-ended tasks that they can sort of think about and be creative, whatever. So they need to balance that, so we
mm.
don't leave people like hanging completely lost and insecure, and not too tight, sort of strangling them, holding them back, and having that sort of. And it's task based, right? So you can be super confident in the strength training session, and then you feel super lost when we do something else, right? It's not like man is always super confident, right? Or Fredrik is always super nervous, right? Because there will be, depending on
Mm.
what we're doing, that practice, right? So it's task based as well, like, and yeah. So, and the coach need to see that, okay, today we're doing this. So I see Fredrik is already nervous, or whatever. So you need to treat me differently, maybe,
Yeah,
yeah. And I can be super confident in the gym. Yeah.
100%. In terms of the business and how it's been so far, what's one mistake that has happened and how did you deal with it?
Mistake in the business?
Yeah, and how did you sort of deal with it, or what was the lesson learned from it?
Yeah, I think there's always when people come in like new. I mean, we sometimes in recruitments, I think sometimes you have this feeling quite early on that it's not really working out, and maybe that's a Swedish thing as well, but you're like, we're not maybe the best of being always like super, you know outspoken and maybe a little bit tough, that would be needed, whatever, because it's like, yeah, they will figure it out, and you sort of beat around the bush a little bit and hope that things will figure out. And that's something I learned along the way, like you need to
Mm,
be like super clear, and you need to take that head on, if because you want to ultimately give them a chance to sort of fit and do the right thing, right? And at least I think that's a pretty common thing, in at least in Sweden, I think. And I mean, the labor laws here is like, basically when you're full-time employed, the labor laws are pretty strong in the favor of the employee, right? So it's you can't just fire people, basically.
mm.
So, but there's something called, I don't know, you have like the first 6 months is like a
Like a
probation
provisional
period.
period. Yeah, yeah.
And what I think people, when you don't do that, and if you're not active from the start and you beat around the bush, a lot of people end up like, and they're realizing, oh shit, this employee has been here for almost 6 months. He's not really performing. We have to let him go, because if we go over this time, it's going to be super tricky, because then they are like, employed. And I ended up there sort of myself in the beginning, and sometimes it could be about culture and mindset and maybe social things, and sometimes more about the sort of work skills. But that's mistakes I feel that I at least see a bit earlier and try to
Mm,
be more active about talking and following up and like showing what demands do we have and what they can improve, etc. Because ultimately you want to give them a chance, and also sometimes you have to cut people loose, and seeing after like this is never going to work. I'm sorry, but I mean you can probably do something really good, but we're not the right company, you're not the right person, sorry, but it's like no hard feelings. And I think that has actually been good to be able to say it, instead of shying away
yeah,
from it, because not that's not really a solution, right? And I think after doing that mistake a couple of times you realize like, yeah, it's not helping me, it's not helping that person, so they can in terms of like the business thing, and I guess like how you mean maybe something how you could deal with relationships or whatever, like if you're an employee as well, like you know being clear and outspoken, and so it's like instead of just thinking
hmm,
things will sort themselves out, sort of.
just being involved in the process.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's at least a learning I've done or a mistake or whatever, that I think
yeah.
it's
And
hopefully a bit better now.
in terms of like the company, where or what are you working on for the future?
You mean on the product level or like a more company level?
Product level.
So we just yeah, marketing gonna have tar and feathers if I say too much, right? They want to keep everything as a surprise, but no, but we I mean we just launched this like generation 5 of the K box. I'm super happy about it with the improvements in the design and some of the features, and we've also been able to like to push the price point as well, so that's pretty yeah, pretty fun to see. I mean, we actually didn't increase our prices for our K-box since we started, so like you have 11 years of inflation that we never increased our prices for. So it's actually a K-box just by that.
Hmm.
And now with this new generation, we you get like more bang for the buck because we made the smaller ones a little bit bigger, etc. So I'm super happy about that. But now we're looking into the K pulley and see if that could be maybe a generation shift there as well. And then we have a pretty cool project together with actually a rack and barbell and weight
Wow.
um, manufacturer in the US. We worked a little bit with them before on a joint project, but now we're doing a bigger joint project together. I think will be pretty interesting to see. I hope we can launch it early in 2024.
Wow,
We're
that
waiting for
quick.
some yeah, we're waiting for some prototypes right now, so we'll see. We'll do some testing and we'll send it over to them, and then they will do some testing, so we'll see. So that's a fun project that I think will be pretty interesting for a lot of people in like SNC world,
Mm,
especially with this working with like the bigger, stronger male athletes like American football, maybe rugby, bigger, stronger athletes. So I think that could be a cool product. Um, yeah, and I think also like in 2024 there will be a lot of things on the app side as well.
right.
Uh, so we're laying like the foundation right now. So the tech team is probably a little bit invisible right now, but they're
They're
busy for
busy.
sure. But it's sort of we're rebuilding a foundation and sort of the back end of the app, and then in the next year we can capitalize on that. So hopefully, will be some really cool features coming out as
Yeah.
well.
How do you sort of set out these next ideas?
How we sell, so
Set
how
up.
we
So how do you like get together and come up with these next advances for the product?
Yeah, I mean, we do get a lot of customer feedback, of course, and I mean, yeah. So I think we have a fairly. I think you have to have a. I think you have to have like a multi-channel approach, or what to
Mm,
say. So, for example, I mean, some things. I don't think sometimes you say like, oh, listen to the customer, right? That's 100%. I think, yeah, that's probably good, like if they have good opinions. But there's also, I mean, some of the worst ideas we also heard comes from customers or people that are like potential customers. uh, so I think you need to be founded in what, using the product, understanding the product yourself, and seeing what I feel, what's nagging me about, what
Mm,
I want to improve. I use it and feel like, oh, this should actually be better. I want this to be more robust or stronger. I want a different feeling. I want this feeling like, and you know, and or look at like the science. If we see a paper that says like this and this, and then like, okay, let's design so we can use this that we actually know from the study to,
mm,
like for example, we um yeah, yeah, for example, when we people ask why we did a seated leg curl, for example, that was based on a study that showed 50% more hypertrophy in a seated versus prone hamstring flexion. So that was one of the reasons why we went with seated. Anyway, so I think there's like, you have to have something, coming from the inside, from the team, from yourself, from using it, like being experts in your product. But then of course also listen to feedback. I mean, could be athletes that are very different from ours, like the NBA players are very different from any, from, I mean, I'm not that super tall myself, and even the tallest guy in the office is like far from tall enough for matching an NBA player, right? So obviously they will see things or experience things that we need to accommodate for. So I would say to be a little bit like so grounded in
mm,
yourself, and believe in your own ideas, and also, like knowledge is built like, knowledge is a little bit like layers, like you're adding a layer. Like, so when you know a subject well enough, you can start, like you can't really contribute in a field before you know it, right? You need to come up to a certain level of knowledge, and then you can start contributing, maybe finding new things, right?
mm,
And and I think we need to be that, like on top. And that's why we also see things that could be better, that maybe a customer won't see, because they have to build more experience and use the product a little bit more. So I think you can't put it on the customer, so to
mm.
speak.
We can take little gems
uh,
from them.
yeah, exactly. But and then there will, yeah, come good things as well that we didn't think of course. And I think it's the best product test as well, because people also, I mean, one classical thing is like, we think about like, oh, this is how the device is supposed to be used, and we start selling it, and then people use it way different from what we thought. Maybe they stand the wrong way, or they do things like wrong,
Hmm.
but it's like, yeah, but they could, right? So then we need to either like teach them how to do it right, maybe put it in a manual or an introduction video, because maybe it's obvious to us, maybe to me, because I
Yeah.
designed it, but it's not super obvious to if you just see a K box, right? So or maybe me more intuitive, or in the manual, or in a video, or maybe even make it sort of stronger or more robust. You can actually do it in the wrong way and still works, or I mean, it doesn't break or whatever. But that's also something I think we learned along the way, when you have this like, this is how it's supposed to be used, and then you design for that. And then it's like, yeah, but people don't read manuals,
Mm.
or so it needs to be
Explained in a better way. I think that
yeah, exactly.
I think that goes back to the university that you were talking about, and they put it on the wall, and then you came up with
Yeah,
the cape pulley.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. That was yeah, and I mean we have tons. I mean we get a lot of good ideas from customers as well. So, but also these classical things. I mean, you can see comments of people that's like, I mean, the thing I've heard like probably 100 times is people like, yeah, you should put a generator on the shaft and generate energy. So when you're spinning, you're working this generator, and then you can power like the K meter, or you can charge your phone or whatever. It's like, yeah, but that would destroy the whole concept,
Mm.
right? Because if I put a generator on the shaft, that will take energy. So that will to take your energy out of the flywheel. You will get less eccentric load. So that will sort of defeat the whole purpose of having a flywheel device. It's It's like from a way to go into a Smith machine where you add friction, and then you lose that concentric to
Mm,
eccentric ratio. So it's not efficient training. I can see where they're coming from, but but then they don't understand the flywheel and the constant. They just see something is spinning and think, like, oh, great, that could generate energy. So maybe it's not super serious suggestion, but still, like knowing the concept, you see, like, oh, but that's not something we can do because that would defeat the purpose.
yeah.
And also, there's so little energy in strength training. People don't realize that, but I mean, we did some calculations. So you can have a hard time even powering a LED lamp with strength training because, like, yeah, it's powerful and it's intense, but for very short periods of time. So in terms of total energy, it's very low. So if you want to power something, you would probably do much better with a bike or a
Mm,
row or something where you don't really have the eccentrics anyway. So you could just power against this generator and you can power your house or whatever in terms of watts and energy and joules, whatever, over time. A cardio setting would be much more
yeah.
better for this,
Because it's
and,
that
and not strength.
continuous thing about it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, 10 sets of, yeah, I mean, 10 reps of squats doesn't matter if you're squatting 300 kilos. That's not going to power a lot of, I mean, it's not like it's going to power your oven for cooking dinner or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting that someone's thought about saving energy. No.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much for giving up your Sunday. I know this is your alone time, so I do apologize for that. Is there? How could people contact you or see what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to email, it's like Frederick, and that's probably not a yeah. Usually with the in UK or everybody want to spell my name with C or whatever, but this is this Swedish spelling, Frederick with a K at the end, Fredrik RIK at excentric.com, or maybe, yeah, you can find me on X or Instagram. I'm probably most active on Instagram. That's basically, I use Instagram mainly for my powerlifting. Um, um, but that's at Fredrik Correa. So I use my name everywhere. So it's probably easy to find Fredrik Correa. Um, yeah, exactly.
Strong power lifter as well, and still doing
Yeah, decent. We'll see.
it.
Yeah.
Decent. You've got competitions coming up soon as well, don't you?
Sorry, next competition.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I just did nationals here, or like master nationals was like 2 weeks ago, and and I won. So now again qualified for national team. So we use nationals to qualify. So I've been on the national team here for quite some years now. So next up is European Championships
Nice.
in February. So yeah, see
How are
if I
you feeling
can.
for that?
I mean, it felt awesome. I mean, this year has been my best year so far, and especially this last 6 months. There's a few things in training that I really, figure out some stuff, and I've also been, I'm adding a little bit more details. I've been a little bit sloppy around some of the details around my training.
Mm,
I before I was really focused like on the program, so I just did what the coach said, and if I managed to do what the coach said, then I'm fine, right? So I don't really like, maybe I slept too little, maybe I didn't eat that super
mm,
well, I didn't maybe warm up, maybe skipped a little bit of accessories, etc. So it's like, yeah, but I made a program. I sort of I made a test, right? I got so and I changed that mindset a little bit over the last couple of years, and I think this year also taking much more, being better at like getting my sleep, for example,
mm,
and felt a big so coming into now I'm working a lot about not lot on my sort of nutrition to sort of tweak that a little bit, and also get my accessory work a little bit more up to point because it's been a little bit on the side. I've been
mm-hmm,
focusing very much on the main lift. So I think training has been going really well, and I have done a few technique changes this year. So if I continue with a little bit more sleep and a little bit better, starting to cooking a little bit more, etc. So yeah, I will say I feel positive I can do quite a bit more. So
nice. I love that because I've followed you for a while and I see that you're constantly pushing it, and I love it. I do love it.
Yeah, yeah, and so I have to thank my club. I mean, we have the best club. I mean, so I mean, when you train together, you have that environment with people on like all levels, from beginners
Mm.
to like people on national teams,
What's the club called?
and it's Täby AK, which athletic club in Sweden, so AK athletic club, or so powerlifting basically. Uh, it's called Täby. I think you find it on TABYAK. Can you find it?
No, no.
Ah, um, but I think it's like a really good environment
Yeah, I think
to,
that is
we have a
important.
really,
So we, coming from S&C, that one of the biggest things that we as coaches try and work on is the culture that we have in the gym. So like for me, as soon as athletes start coming in, everyone gets a fist bump. I ask them, "How was your day? What have you been up to?" Just like some basic knowledge, like
mm,
did you sleep well? Did you eat well? Have you drunk water? Just normal questions, but it sort of builds that thing where as soon as they come in, they know I'm going to be ready for them, and we always talk and have a laugh during the session as well, which I think is what you're alluding to, is having that community sense within the club.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it also creates an accountability because they're kind of like, oh, people know I'm starting a like a peaking block or whatever, and I know the people I train with, like, oh, you have maybe your nationals coming up or world championship coming up, or and I know what they've been doing. So if they're like lagging behind, they say
Mm,
like, yeah, but you usually do much more than that, or and also, I mean, people like, for example, I have this goal of pulling 300 kilos deadlift, and everybody in the gym knows that. And so when they see I'm starting getting close and peaking, people like, okay, so I know you did 295 last week, so are you pulling for 300 today? And I can't really like, I mean, you have that commitment, and knowing that people would expect me to, yeah, if you pull 295 this Wednesday,
mm,
you're probably going really close to 300 next week, right? People will expect that because that's how the peaking block looks like, and they know what I did. And that helps me, like, oh, I need to get my sleep in, I need to eat
mm,
good over the week, and I can't like just crash over the weekend, because then next Wednesday session I can't come down wrecked and put on 290. People's like, what happened, right? So I think that builds a accountability, and you have your and also support when it's not going well, right? I had a friend now. She had the worst. She had a really bad peaking. She did the Euros now, and she had a
mm.
really bad peaking with pain and injuries, whatever. So that was a lot like to help her push her through. And I say like, it's not that I know it feels bad because you expected more than like you expected a better peak than your last big competition, but you are actually doing quite okay. But maybe it's not as good as you've done before, but you're still doing really well. And on comp day, we know that she's always super strong on comp day. She always like does her best, like so then it becomes like supporting her, etc. So, but yeah, so that's what I like actually. So I think that's actually the charm for me with
Mm.
powerlifting, that you're like one big group, that you're training together, from 14. So our oldest athlete is like 74,
Wow.
and she's competed for like 40 years. She's world records, whatever. I mean, she's been competing forever. And down to like 14, 15, girls, boys, guys, it's like the mix. And some are good overall,
Mm.
some are crazy deadlifts, but they suck on bench. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. We train together, so it's like a big team, but it's still an individual sport.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can train whenever I want. If somebody wants to, train 6 days a week, they train 6 days a week. Nobody's stopping them, right? And if they want to quit, nobody's stopping them. You come there by free will. So I think that's a nice environment. I think. I mean, that's what attracted me, at least. The powerlifting and it's a fairly nice community as well.
Mm.
Uh, you
Powerlifting
know,
tends to be. I've been to a couple powerlifting gyms, and everyone's sort of in this consensus where everyone's just helping each other push or move in everyone
yeah,
to keep climbing.
Yeah, super friendly. And I reached out to some really high level lifters when I see something they've done. I have questions about their training or they're doing, or I see they maybe they switch technique or something, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So and maybe that guy is built maybe similar to me or had a similar squat technique, and I see he's changing something. Maybe I reach out, and people are really good at like explaining
Mm,
and helping out over DMs, whatever. It's like this random guy from Sweden, you know, reaches out to maybe a world champion, whatever, and so I think it's a pretty nice community and helpful community in that sense. And we also need our competitors. Like, yeah, we like to win, but also without competitors. So it's like I know some of my fiercest competitors that I meet. I have a Norwegian guy, for example. He always beats me. So by 5-10 kilos, whatever. So I'm chasing him, but still we talk all the time. We DM back and forth and like see he's doing well, I'm
mm,
doing well, whatever. So as soon as I post something, I know he's in my DMs like 5 seconds later, like, oh, that's a crazy pull, like blah blah blah. So we're supporting and helping, each other and giving tips and ask about equipment. Okay, I saw that you have these new shoes. Are they good?
mm,
I'm looking for whatever. So we have so I think it's a kind of a nice sort of thing where you're competing but you're still friends. And I see that across the sport. I would say very don't see that many that like beefs and stuff in the sport, even though that these guys are gonna it's about these two guys that gonna clash about the world championship, and they
mhm.
still maybe train together or
Talk to each
hang
other,
out
yeah.
even. Yeah, so it's a I like that about the sport.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Speaking on ages, what's the sort of youngest you'd recommend using a K box?
Oh, good question. I actually discussed that yesterday. We had a course in our in-house Friday with 20 physios, and that question came up. So I would say, like, in terms of, I would say, so uh, what I said to them is like, I don't really see a lower limit to use a K box because it's user controlled and you set the intensity yourself and you can't really load more than you. I mean, how much can you put into the
Mm,
flywheel? A weak person can't get a crazy load because they won't be able to accelerate that much, right? So it's like their own energy that they're absorbing. So, and I know my own kids that basically grew up with flywheel.
mm,
They saw a flywheel before they saw a weight. And I had one of my oldest daughter when she was like 4 or something, 4 or 5. I got annoyed with somebody like complaining about its flywheel was so complicated, blah blah blah. So I just recorded a video with her, like, okay, can you please explain to me now how you can do a deadlift or high pull and show how the device works? And she's like 4 years old, explain like, oh, you put on the flywheel here, and then you set the length, and then you start spinning the flywheel, whatever. And she could do a little bit of high pulls and did a good like intro video. So anyway, but so I'm thinking there's not really, and I think I mean, I don't think we should be afraid to do a little bit of strength training with younger kids, you know.
I agree.
But I would say like, but do you need to go and buy a K box to do
Yeah.
it? If you're 8, if you're 9, if you're 10, let's say you coach a soccer team or hockey team or rugby team, I would say no. You probably have better things to buy or use your money for, and you can do fine with body weight and whatever. But I think if you come across a K box, yeah, of course they can use it. I mean, even if you're like 11 or 12, do something simple. Do a little bit of rows, do a little bit of high pulls, whatever. It doesn't have to be complicated. And like I said, I think the learning, like we talked about, the dynamics of the movement, that it's a little bit more alive. There's a control aspect that you don't really get with weight. So I can also see, like, in terms of like an education for
Mm,
an athlete to be exposed to that is good. uh, so, but I mean, definitely from like serious athletes that are training, fairly focused for sports, when they come up 14,
mhm.
15, for sure they can use the K box. I
I
mean,
always use this example. So I've been asked a couple times, how old do you think an athlete should be before they start weight training? And I always have this one thing is like, how often does your kid jump? How often does your kid climb a tree? that's all load based. That they're loading their hands and their forearms and their muscles to lift themselves up. How often are they jumping? That's impact. You're always exploding up and then you're coming down. You're using both eccentric and concentric movements. So again, I wouldn't load an athlete at 5 years old, but I can teach them basic movements, and then
Yeah, exactly.
I can progress. So I was kind of intrigued when you said my daughter that was 4 or 5 years old was able to do a high pull, because that kids should be they're already lifting. Like when they come out the womb, they're trying to figure out their neck. They're using those neck
Yeah,
exercises. It's load. Everything is load.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, but people also need to understand that with the flywheel, that the load comes from the user
Hmm.
itself, right?
Is that your
I've seen,
biggest? Is that your biggest sort of feud with people when they use the K box or sort of review the K box? Is they don't know that it's mostly user load.
yeah, exactly, and then I think they can, some things can, you know, if you apply the sort of gravitational thinking, you can end up in the wrong place when if you look at flywheel. I've seen, for example, guys doing sort of Jefferson curls on the K
Mm,
box, for example. There are always tons of comments. I know a physio did that. He has a K box at home. He has a fairly good following here in Sweden. He did Jefferson curls, and the comments they went nuts, like, "Oh, you can't put all that load because he pulled really hard at the end of the motion and then absorbed most of it at the top when it's fairly straight." But then he keeps a little bit of energy in the flywheel to pull him down into that deep position. But did you see that intense final pull and then him going all the way down? It's like, oh, they looked at him like he was pulling like 200 kilos. Like, yeah, but he's loading the top part and he's like stretching in the bottom part, and he doesn't have the same load because he's absorbing most at the
mm,
top. And then he's just like, so he's basically body weight at the bottom, and then he going up slowly, and then he pulls harder, so he's working, you know he has a heavy load at the top but a low at the bottom. But people don't understand that. They just think he's going, they just see something intense and extreme in terms of like, in motion. If you think, oh, that must be crazy dangerous
mm.
for your back, it's like, no, it's not. And but people don't get it if you don't try it. But yeah, so I guess that's pretty common. uh, it's difficult to explain as well. I mean, people need to try it, and most people getting up on the K box, even if you give them an introduction, first time they test it, they're like, okay, now I get it.
Mm.
It's not that they're not smart or not listening or whatever. I mean, it is a different feeling, and you get that after a couple of reps. So,
Yeah. No. Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on and letting me pick your brain
oh,
on
thank
this.
you. Oh, thank you. And yeah, so there's plenty to talk more to talk about.
Yeah, I
So
was actually going to say when the new releases come, if you want to come back on and sort of talk about them and sort of explain your way through them, I would love to have you back on.
yeah, I mean, sure, we can talk. I mean, there's a lot of cool. I think we talked a little bit about successful sport examples, and I think that I have a there's really cool implementations that I've seen customers doing, like in terms of like the sport specific stuff
Mm,
that is pretty cool. And also like the metabolic training. I think flywheel training can be really good for that. We didn't really touch upon that today. I mean, I think PAP is also like, or PAPE is
up, yeah,
really
yeah.
interesting. Exactly. It's some really good applications there that we see some of our coaches and athletes do, etc. So I'm happy to talk about training if somebody wants to listen. So.
Yeah, no, I'll love to have you back on. I know that you might be pushed for time today, or I'll keep you in for another
Mm.
hour just talking about training.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to jump on another time for
Perfect.
sure.
And I'm really interested to hear about what you've got coming up as well.
Yeah, yeah, we'll see. See you this spring then.
Perfect. See you later.
Huh?
Peace.